Conversation with a Geographer. I'm Mike DeVivo, professor of geography at Grand Rapids Community College, and today we're very, very fortunate to have William Wyckoff, emeritus professor of geography at Montana State University. Bill, thank you so much for being able to join us today and being willing to join us.
Oh, you bet, Mike. It's a pleasure. Good to see you.
Absolutely good to see you. As we normally begin these conversations, I like to chat a little bit about your early interests in geography, where you grew up, and what might have captivated you to explore geography further.
Sure. I grew up in Southern California, in the suburbs. Burbank, California is where I was born and raised. And I think my geography bug started when I was about 4 or 5 years old. And I do have that connection, I think, in my memory anyway. I loved weather, and I loved weather maps. And so I started as a kid, I think age 6 or 7, subscribing to the daily weather maps. And so I would wait by the mailbox, this little kid, and get the weather map and open it up and try to figure out what was going on. And I think I started into the world of geography wanting to become a meteorologist.
Really?
And so that continued, that sort of dream of, and curiosity about the weather extended into college. And so I went to Cal State Northridge as an undergraduate in physics to begin with, because I was going to become a meteorologist. And then I started taking these courses in geography. I took a course on climatology from Arnold Port, and I took courses in cultural geography from Jim Allen and Dave Hornbeck. And suddenly, the weather was fascinating, but what geography did was bring together the physical and the human. And that's really when, I got into the discipline of geography, realized what it was, and shifted gears a little bit to more on the human side of geography, which is a trend I guess I continued at the graduate level. I went to Syracuse University from Northridge and did a master's and a PhD there with Don Meinig, very much in the realm of historical and cultural geography of North America. But yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say let's chat just a little bit about Northridge, your Northridge experiences. So you said that you took courses from Jim Allen and Dave Hornbeck and Court. What do you think really captivated you in their teaching?
I think first of all, Northridge was a great environment because class sizes were small. You really got to know your professors. It was a very good education. At that time,
it had a stellar geography. There were so many faculty in the department.
Absolutely, and that was just serendipity. As I say, I started out as a physics major. So, but when I discovered the geography department, it was one of the largest in North America, and the classes were small. The teachers were, people like Jim Allen, for example, were so enthusiastic. Dave Hornbeck, so full of energy and truly loved, I think, what they did was largely teach. And they also did good research. And Dave did his on California. And Jim was already fascinated with the cultural geography of Los Angeles and so forth. And so I think some of that enthusiasm certainly rubbed off on a young undergraduate like myself. I really appreciated that,
Did Jim encourage you to go to Syracuse?
He did. Yeah, he did. And because he knew Don Meinig. And he had spent a lot of time in upstate New York, obviously, with his Syracuse background. And so I applied to Syracuse. I applied to University of Wisconsin. I applied to Berkeley, and I applied to University of Oregon, which were all good schools. And I, in fact, was kind of leaning on going to the University of Wisconsin to study with David Ward.
Right.
I had at least was thinking about accepting that offer, and then I got a phone call. And the phone call was from Don Meinig.
Really?
At Syracuse. And in 10 minutes, he changed my mind. And he told me on that phone call about all the great things that were going on in upstate New York and the department there with David Sofer and the great Department of History also there. And so within 10 minutes, he was a great used car salesman. He really sold upstate New York. So that was, I changed my mind and went to Syracuse, and of course never regretted it. David Ward was a fine scholar, but he ended up going more on to administration, became
Right.
chancellor there at the university, and so I was very fortunate to get that phone call from Don. I'm glad I answered.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
And so while you were at Syracuse, did you have fellow graduate students that you engaged in dialogue with and brainstorming about historical geography?
It was a great mix of people. I was there. I shared an office with Rob Kent, who was a Latin Americanist, and is now, interestingly, at Cal State Northridge, I believe, as a dean. And I also shared an office with Gary Hausladen, who was interested in at that time, the Soviet Union. And there were a number of people. Craig Colton came in my second or third year, so I got to know Craig. And right about the time I was leaving, Marie Price came in with her interest in Latin American human geography and historical geography. So it was a nice sort of eclectic mix of people that I happened in with, and it was a great faculty at that time. I was there when John Agnew was there on the human side, and I was fortunate enough to be there with David Sofer as well as Don Meinig, and then Meinig encouraged me to take a lot of courses in the Department of History. And the Department of English, actually, American literature and so forth. So
Is that right?
yeah. So I had some great courses with a man named Walter Sutton, who did the literature of the American frontier, and I did some great readings courses in the history department with some fine scholars. So it was a nice time to be there.
I guess I think of graduate students in geography taking courses in other fields, history, geology, but rarely do I see them take courses in literature or being encouraged to take courses in literature.
That's right.
And yet that's a
that.
gold mine. It enhances your writing in terms of creating really attractive narratives.
That's an important thing that I tried to learn not only from the English profs and from the literary style, obviously, of what I was reading and studying, but also from Don's own work. I think Don was certainly a good model for me to really work on vocabulary and really work on words that told interesting geographical stories, about how landscapes evolved over time or about how regions changed and so forth. So, but yes, Don always encouraged me to look at literature. I did a master's thesis on novelists of the Great Plains, and people like Willa Cather and Ole Rovog. And so I read all these novels of people that had lived out on the plains, as Willa Cather had in Nebraska and Rovog in the Dakotas and so forth, and then tried to ferret out what was the special character of literature that could inform the geographer. And that was the topic of my master's thesis. So that was probably also why Don, he already knew I was interested, I think, in English and in writing and so forth. And given my interest in literature at the master's level. For the PhD, I did a study on upstate New York on the Holland Land Company. And I saw it as more of a traditional exercise with a lot of archival work in historical geography. And that became a book called The Developer's Frontier after I finished my PhD there in '82. Yeah.
That was published when you went to Georgia, right?
Yeah, it was actually not published until I got out of Georgia. I left Georgia in '86. I was there for 2 years in their very fine geography department, and then went to Montana State University and finished the writing of the book there, and it was published in '88, I believe, in the late '80s.
When you went to Georgia, were you there as a replacement for Divorcey?
No, Lou was there when I was there, which was great, and he was a great friend and colleague. And I think it was just a human position that had opened up, and it was a fairly flexible application, in terms of what they were looking for. And so it was a very nice interlude in my life. I think my wife and I decided we didn't want to spend our lives in the South, and I was more interested in frankly getting out west and doing more on the historical and cultural geography of the American West. So actually in the 2 summers I had at Georgia, I got some money. We went out to spent the summers in Colorado and started working on some Colorado projects. So, no, Georgia was a great department. And Lou was a wonderful colleague too. I was fortunate to get to know him.
Well, he certainly produced some excellent work in historical geography. And as far as these open positions in human geography go,
Right.
I think that ship has sailed.
Could be.
It's unfortunate
agree.
in many ways,
Sure, sure.
but
It's a different job market now, and one's training is different. I know when I went there, I think they needed somebody to teach economic geography, and so I taught a lot of economic geography when I was there. Which was good training for me and a good background to have. But,
absolutely.
Yeah.
So you went to Montana State, and you had your book published by Yale University Press, and
Right.
you continued to conduct research in historical geography, albeit concentrating really on the American West, which is a
Yes.
far cry really from New York State.
That's right. That's right. I mean, there were some parallels in that I was interested in what I think you guess now call the term settler colonialism, right? I was interested in that initial period of Euro-American occupants, Native American displacement, and so forth. And that's what I wrote about in upstate New York, right? With all the land company coming in and surveying the land and establishing the towns and taverns and all that, and putting Native Americans on reservations at that time in upstate New York. And so that kind of theme, writ large, is sort of what drew me to Colorado and looking at the historical geography of the far American West. And so I see that kind of continuity. It certainly helped prepare me. My work in the East helped prepare me, I think, for looking at the West, in some unusual ways, some good
Well,
ways.
it's fascinating because we don't usually see historical geographers of North America
Right.
really moving beyond a particular regional focus.
That's true. And so that, I think, it served me well. And I've always, had a kind of, even though I've done most of my writing on the West, I've, tried to continue to have a curiosity about the larger North American setting. And certainly that was part of what I learned from Don Meinig too. He thought big, and his scale was big, as his 4-volume study demonstrates, right? He was not afraid to do that. And so I'm working on a book right now that is national in scale, actually. So
Great. Well,
I've been writing. Go ahead.
Let's talk about Meinig just for a few moments
Sure,
and
yeah,
elaborate on him, because he was certainly quite the wordsmith, and it seems like in his Shaping of America volumes, there is no sentence that is not providing the reader with very interesting and important information.
Yes, he was a wordsmith. Yes, he really worked. He did not use a word processor. He wrote with a black pen on a yellow pad of paper, and you could see when you go into his office, he would be in the back of the office. His back would be facing you, and he would turn around, and you could see all these yellow pads of paper with all these scratch outs and arrows on them and little sketch maps and so forth. So he worked, literally sentence by sentence on those books. And, they did take a while to write, of course. And he just made it part of his everyday routine to do some writing. And so I learned that a lot from him too, that his consistency and his routine produced these large books and the great maps and schematic diagrams along with them. And I think he wrote his words, Mike, were much integrated with his spatial thinking and with his ways of visualizing, and the way he integrated the maps and the schematic diagrams with his arguments and with his writing. And so I think that's another thing that I think we all appreciate from looking at his work, how effective he was at that, much more than most historians are. Although a lot of the material he wrote about was very historical, right?
Sure.
A lot of the facts, but the way he spatialized them and the way he contextualized them in maps and diagrams was, I think, what made his work special.
Well, I think one thing that continues to strike me is was the appearance of the eastern seaboard of North America in the first volume of Shaping of America. The map is just enchanting. It's mesmerizing to see that this is the perspective of those early colonizers, those early explorers.
That's right.
You know,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it gives us a whole new way of looking at things. He was certainly an intellectual giant. Wes Dow, one of his early students, told
Yes.
me once that he was intellectually intimidating in some ways, and Wes Dow, who interviewed so many giants in the
did.
field,
That's
was
right.
not intimidated by very many people, he told me.
No, I can imagine, right?
You know?
Right, yes,
He
absolutely.
told me when he went to defend his dissertation,
Right.
and he walked out, and I guess he was still a little nervous, I suppose, when you defend your dissertation. You kind of are.
Right.
And Donald Meinig said to him afterward, "Piece of cake."
That must have lifted a great weight from his chest.
I imagine so.
Right.
You know,
Yes,
but I
no.
guess no kinder words could have been said by his mentor.
Exactly. Right. Yes. No,
So
he was very. He let me work. You know, one of the things I enjoyed about him is he let me have a long chain, a long rope. You know, he would let me go off for months and do some work in Western New York on my dissertation, and he didn't set really strict deadlines. I like to work independently, and apparently he trusted me enough to do that. And then I would, send him a chapter or spend an afternoon with him going through material, and then I would go off and work on it. And so we were a good team that way. He didn't try to micromanage me, but I was still able to benefit from our long talks together and his very thoughtful editing that he was able to do with me and so forth. So we were a good match in terms of personalities, I guess.
Speaking of editing, can you reflect upon the editing that he provided for a moment, and maybe offer some insight concerning some words he may have changed, some style he might have adjusted that you delivered, or some concepts?
Yeah, I can't really think of a particular example. I know I would get chapters back, and he would try to encourage all of us to write in an active voice, not passive voice. And he would encourage clear, declarative sentences. He always liked to write longer sentences than I preferred. So we have our differences too. And I kind of like to eliminate more of, some of the adjectives than he wrote in. But he was always very perceptive in leading me through topic sentences and paragraphs, and in getting me to try to rearrange some of those to make a line of argument more clear. But he didn't have to heavily edit what I wrote. I think we were on a good wavelength. And then he also helped me, I think, imagine visuals and maps. Maybe they were of Western New York or whatever project I was working on. And so he was good that way too in terms of editing. He thought spatially.
Did he ever provide any insight concerning where he'd come from with regard to his graduate training or lack of training in Washington?
Right. Well, as I think a lot of folks do know, he grew up in a rural area, and was, as he liked to say it, he was also a geographer at young age. He used to watch the trains go by and figure out train schedules and look at the old maps and so forth. So I think that certainly translated into his later ability to think spatially. And of course, he wrote that great book, The Great Columbia Plain, about his own home area.
Mm-hmm.
It allowed him to do that. So yes, he often talked. When I was older, when he was older, I would go and stay with him in upstate New York, stay at his house with he and Lee, and we would spend the evenings. And he would talk about certainly growing up in Palouse, Washington, and the small town world that eventually he left behind. But I think that did have a big imprinting on him, if you will, and was really the inspiration for one of his best books. And it was to look in your own backyard, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to write about what you grew up with. And that's what he ended up doing for his dissertation. And, I think it still remains a a great example of regional historical geography right down
Oh,
there.
absolutely. It's on my computer.
Yeah, yeah.
It's really a good piece of work.
It is.
Good. It's excellent.
It's exceptional. Right, right.
Oh,
Absolutely.
indeed. So
Yep.
let's move on now to Montana. There you are at Montana State, and you're teaching courses. And do you
Right.
teach a historical geography, or did you teach a historical
I
geography
did.
course?
Yes, I taught a historical geography of North America course for 25, 30 years here, and I also taught a cultural geography course of the United States here. It was a great set of courses for me. I taught the capstone course in geographical thought for our majors in geography here. And then, of course, world, regional, and human geography. As far as I was concerned, it was an ideal list of courses to teach. I was able to pretty much write my own curriculum here. I came, Mike, into a Department of Earth Sciences, as you may know, which is a conjoined group of geologists and geographers. And, the geologists looked at me as this historical, cultural guy and said, well, you go off and do whatever you want, Bill, as long as you publish and, fill your classes. And they let me do what I wanted, and it was wonderful. And so I was able to teach what I thought was a good course in historical geography here for many, many years, and often had 30, 40 students in it.
That's a lot of students.
Yeah, yeah.
Was it a general education course for many, or was it?
No, it wasn't. It was an upper division course. It fulfilled a requirement in human geography within our department. A lot of students from history took it. Apparently, it had a pretty good rep on campus, and so I got a nice mix of students in there, from beyond the department. But that was, it was a lot of fun, obviously.
Well, that's great. So let's talk a bit about your textbooks.
Sure. That kind of dropped into my world in the late 1990s. And it was serendipitous. I had a friend and colleague in town, Dan Caveney, who worked for Prentice Hall, and he was my textbook rep. And Dan was also, and he lived in Bozeman. And at the same time, he was a development editor for Prentice Hall, which is now Pearson.
Right.
And he was working with Les Roundtree and Marie Price and Martin Lewis on a new kind of world geography textbook. And it wasn't quite coming together. They weren't able to quite finish it. And so Dan dropped into my office one day and he said, hey, do you want to work on a textbook? And I said, well, tell me about it. And I knew all the other authors, and they were all good friends and so forth. And so by the end of that conversation, I was a textbook author, and I said I would do it. And he said, well, there are several chapters that they haven't worked on yet and that you would have to work on. And North America is at the top of the list. And we actually need this chapter in about 4 weeks, and get working on it, And so I started to work on this North America chapter with a kind of a template that the other authors had already put together. And then before I knew it, I was doing chapters on Oceania and on the Middle East and on Eurasia, Russia, at that time. And so it was a wonderful project, not only because the book was very successful, but because it was an innovative book in the 1990s, and because it was a book I was able to work on for over 20 years with 3 of the best people in geography. It was the collegiality of the project that made it so memorable. And so as we would go from edition to edition, and we ended up having 2 books, a big book and a smaller book, we would meet at one another's house somewhere. It would maybe be in the Bay Area. It would be in Virginia. It would be here in Bozeman. And we'd have a great several days together. And we would brainstorm, about new ideas for the book. And so it was a great friendship that we lost Les a few years ago, but it was a great friendship that Marie and Martin and I and our families still continue.
That's great. And Dan was a great guy and a great editor, I think.
Yes, Dan. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, he convinced me. I was using a different textbook in the 90s. And I looked at this new textbook, Diversity Amid Globalization. I talked with him. I looked it over a bit more at an NCGE meeting, and in the middle of the academic year, I switched books.
Wow, that's good.
and I've used it ever since. you
Great.
know?
Yeah.
So
Well, I
no,
think the innovative parts of it were, one, it really did focus on globalization, and that's a tried and true word now, but this was over 20 years ago, and a
absolutely.
lot of the older regional geographies really didn't engage with that that reality, right, of learning about a region and how it was connected with the rest of the world. And I think the other thing that was particularly innovative was we did not go through the A to Z laundry list of countries. Here's
Absolutely.
Costa Rica. Here's a paragraph on Costa Rica. What we did is a thematic approach, right? And we talked
Right.
about environment, and we talked about population, culture, and politics, and economic development. And I think we integrated the regional story into those 5 themes. And going along with that, we had a super map program that
Absolutely.
I can
The
thank
maps are
Prentice Hall
great.
at Pearson. Maps are
The
great.
thematic maps
Yeah,
are, which have a remarkable level of consistency from one chapter to another.
that's right. Yeah, we worked on
They
that.
really frame the text very well.
It was great for student learning, and it was great to
Absolutely.
integrate our prose with that. And so that all came together in that first edition, and the book took off, and it did very well. And so and Dan, of course, was very effective at selling the book, and it continued to meet with us and develop with us more new ideas and so forth. And so it became a good chunk of my life. It didn't take over my creative life, which is a good thing. It didn't. And I had 3 other co-authors, right? So we were all a good team. It was a small enough piece of our world that we were able to continue, each of us, with our careers and with our research and books and so forth, right? But it certainly was an engaging and a refreshing and energizing part of my life. It wasn't a draining thing, which was great, because I think a textbook could be, if you didn't like your co-authors and if it just got to be humdrum, But I don't think that was ever a problem with us.
Well, the topic is so broad, world regional geography, right?
That's right.
I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
you're, you're always going to win with it. You're always
Yeah.
going to win with that topic if you do it right, you have the right maps, and you provide those nicely written narratives within the chapters. And,
Right,
and
right.
you've all been successful doing that.
And you always have to be refreshing it. We were one of the first textbooks that really wrote about global climate change
Yeah.
and how that was going to shape different regions around the world. And we tried to take on interesting topics in music, in food, geography. So we tried to make it a book that students would enjoy and learn from at the same time. And I think that was an important part of what kept the book going, and frankly kept our sales up, and kept students interested in it. So I'm glad to hear that you're still using it. People out there are still using it. That's great.
Still using it, yeah. So, but and to go on to some of your other work, let's talk about some of the research you've done in the American West.
Sure.
Let's
sure.
talk about Colorado, for example.
Colorado, as I said earlier, I got started with an interest in Colorado when I was living in Georgia. It was in the mid 80s. And I was keen to take Don Meinig's advice in an article that he wrote in 1972 called American Wests. And he identified these different regions of the American West that
Right.
deserved more detailed treatment. So I took on Colorado. It was one of his regions, and he had written a couple of paragraphs about Colorado, but I figured, well, maybe this would be a good book, And so that led me into, in the 90s, putting together the different chapters for Creating Colorado, The Making of a Western New York Landscape, which Yale also published, and which I thought Colorado deserved a book length treatment. And what I tried to do was, people have called it environmental history. I don't know that it was that. I think it was historical geography, but there were important sensibilities in it about environment and environmental impacts. There were also obviously an interest in landscape and in the cultural landscapes of places like mining towns and Denver and the Eastern Plains and so forth. And I tried to simply write a good readable narrative, integrated a lot of historical photographs and maps. There are, I think, over 100 figures in that book, and to tell Colorado's story. Obviously, it's just one person's interpretation, but I think it was a nice example of regional historical geography in the American West, and so the book was pretty well received, I think, and I certainly learned a lot about Colorado. I was able to visit every every county in the state. I did most of my research in Denver and to a lesser extent in Colorado Springs, but at the Denver Public Library, which has a great archive on Colorado and all the West. Yeah, I ended up spending a lot of time in Colorado, lived some off and on in Denver in the summers and so forth, and still enjoy Denver. I have a book coming out in a few months on Denver, probably in a distant way related to that earlier book, although this is a more contemporary one. So, Colorado.
That's great.
Colorado was a great excuse to really explore what Meinig was suggesting, and that is to do these book-length treatments of Western American regions.
That's yeah. I remember that article. That was it in the 70s?
Yeah, it was 72. It was actually before I started college. It was written, but I was at Northridge just after it was a special issue. It was June 1972, special issue of the Annals. And there are all kinds of great, interesting people in that issue. James Vance has a piece on California, and J.B. Jackson has an essay in there, and John Fraser Hart has a piece on the Midwest, and Meinig has this article called "American Wests," plural.
Wasn't it? Was that the one that American West preface to a geographical interpretation? Right.
It was basically a book prospectus that he was writing at that time. He never did write that book, but he took a lot of the same ideas and transferred those into the Shaping of America series. So, but that's what I picked up on as an undergraduate, probably with some of my Northridge profs. That's when I read it, and so once I got tenure at Montana State, that's a freeing thing, and it allowed me to really think about the next book, which was going to be Colorado. So
that's great. Let's talk about your field guide.
Oh, sure. Well, that was a phase of my life. In between the Colorado book and the field guide was a book of repeat photography on Montana.
Right.
Very visual book, right? And so that got me to every county in Montana, and to use a historical photograph, let's say taken in 1915, and then try to take the same photograph, 80 years later or whatever it was, and then to write an essay about it. And so it was that. The reason I mentioned that book is that it really prepped me to write the field guide, because that got me out on the landscape a lot in Montana. It got me thinking about visualization using photography to tell stories about landscape. And so I think after the Montana book was published, and that was published, I think, in 2006 with the Weyerhaeuser series with the University of Washington Press. And that seemed to go over pretty well. And so that got me fishing around for something a little bit larger in scale, more regional in scale, and also on that same kind of visual vibe, looking at landscape. And so I started to make this list on a big piece of paper about all the landscape features of the West that were quintessential, important, would help people learn about the Western American landscape. Some of those features were physical, like sagebrush, right, or dust devils, and others were very cultural and historical, right, like Mormon country and Mormon landscapes and so on. And so piece by piece, I quickly came to a list of at least 100 features. I had to, in the end, prune it back to 100, but that got me thinking about a larger scale project. And it was also, frankly, Mike, a good excuse to go out and learn more about the West. I knew Southern California.
What a nightmare.
Colorado. I knew Montana. But, it was a great excuse to go to every county in the American West, which is what I ended up doing in that book. And, I still don't know many areas of the West that well, but at least it forced me to go out there and really look. And then to think about how one communicates in visual form, a theme, a message, and because it was going to be a field guide, right? And so you wanted to use visuals. I took a hell of a lot of pictures. I took over 18,000 pictures for that. And I ended up with, I think, 400 and some color pictures of mine in the book. But it took a lot of editing, obviously, and a lot of bad pictures. Thankfully, in the digital age, right, that's very, very doable. But to get the right picture from the right perspective, just takes some I don't know, it just takes some time in the field, and it just takes some good luck sometimes, some good lighting. But that's what I try to develop in the field guide, to try to use pictures to communicate to people important geographical ideas. And there are several dozen maps in the book that I think are good as well, and the prose hopefully holds up. But it was a lot of fun. I learned a lot in that project about corners of the West that I didn't know much about, like southeastern New Mexico. Why the hell would you go to southeastern New Mexico, right? Unless you were born and raised there. It's flat as a pancake, a lot of oil, a lot of heat in the summer, but places like Hobbs, New Mexico, it was a good excuse to get me out there and to understand more about those landscapes.
Well, it's certainly a great piece of work. And,
thank you. It was a lot of fun to do. Yeah.
With just a minute to go, I'm going to ask you to think about where you've been, think about your career, and think about whether or not you have any words of wisdom or some advice for students interested in geography, or specifically interested in historical geography today.
Right.
And maybe even advice for colleagues in the field today.
Well, historical geography is a lot different today than it was, back when I was a student. I think it's evolved, and I think to engage with it, you have to evolve with it. And I would say read extensively outside of our little field, whether that takes you to environmental history or to cultural studies, whatever it might be. I think that's always what makes the best geography, to bring in ideas and new ideas from other fields. And so I would encourage young colleagues or students to do that, and to we're in the 21st century. Connect with the world that you see today. Engage with the world. Historical geography that is purely archaic never excited me. So you have to connect the past with the present. That's something Don always did too in his work. His Shaping of America series brought us up to the year 2000. His book on the Southwest brought us up to the year 1970. The field guide was designed to bring us up to the world that I saw, 10 years ago. So I think that's another important lesson for aspiring historical geographers. Don't just get mired in the past and the archives, but make it relevant for your readers, for your students today, because I think that's going to get readers. And without that, I think you're maybe going to write a very, very good scholarly study that nobody opens up and reads.
Well,
that would be my...
That's remarkably astute to me as I reflect upon this, because I'm thinking, here we are practicing this craft of historical geography,
sure,
devoted to really the reconstruction of past landscapes. Let's make it relevant today. Let's make those past landscapes, or our interpretation of those past landscapes, relevant today.
That's it. You got it. And I think that's something that I still try to do, in my work right now, and hopefully we'll continue that for a good number of years in the future.
Bill, thank you so much for spending this time with us.
Sure,
it's really been a
great
pleasure.
Fun.
All right.
Mike.
And this concludes this episode of Conversation with a Geographer. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.